Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at a complete example of creating a dynamic web project, a web application that just contains a form using strict MVC architecture with form validation built in. So I'm going to do everything from scratch in this tutorial, except that I'm going to use the user bean from previous tutorials, and the user bean, you'll recall, has an email and a password property, and it has a method which validates that property and checks if it is valid or not, both of those properties. And if they are not valid, it sets a message which you can retrieve via getMessage, which is a method up here somewhere. There we go, getMessage. So I'm going to create a new dynamic web project here. So I'm going to go to New Project, Dynamic Web Project, and I'm going to call this MVC Form. And let's just go through this, and I can accept the defaults here. And I'm just going to go to my previous project and just right click this beans package, go to copy, and right click my MVC Form project and go to paste. Doesn't like that. Let's try copying the user.java, which I think will work. Let's right click the project and paste. And doesn't like that either. Let's try holding down Control and dragging it into the project. Finally, we've got some success. Okay. Now this needs to be in a package called beans, of course. So I'm just going to right click this and go to New Package, Beans. And let's just drag this user into beans. Okay, so I think that looks good now. And I'm going to close the old project here. So right click and go to Close Project. Okay, so we've got a new project and we've got a user bean in it. And I'm going to create a servlet here. Let's go to New Other and servlet. And I'm going to call this controller. And let's, in the real world, you could either call this like shop or login or whatever you want to call it. I don't know. Probably not login actually if it's your controller, but something nicer. Or you could just change the mapping in the web.xml file under web content there to give it a nicer name. But let's put this in a package called controller and make sure it's got do get and do post methods. And now I should already be able to run that, check that it works. In fact, I'll just close these files from my previous project, and let's run the controller and click finish, and make sure I've got controller highlighted, highlighted definitely, and then run this, and they always use this server. And it looks okay. Update the context root, we'll have that as well. And finally, if we're in luck, we will run the controller. Okay, so that all looks good. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a form. So under web content, I'll right click and create a new JSP, and let's call it login.jsp. And login.jsp is just going to have a form in it for logging in. I'm going to say here form action. I'm going to give it an action which I'll set in a minute, and method I'm going to set to post, which you should usually set for forms. And let's just close the form there, and I'll have a couple of controls on it. Well, I'll have a hidden input control here, which I'll say input type equals hidden, and name equals action, and value equals do login. So if my controller servlet finds that the action parameter is set to do login, it knows that this form has been submitted. And let's also give this a input type equals text with a name of email and a value which I'll set a little bit later, and let's just close that tag there like this, and then let's copy that, and I want another one of those, and I'm going to call this password, so it's just got an email and a password. And finally I also want a button to submit it with, so input type equals submit, and the name doesn't matter for that, and the value I'm just going to set to OK, or I could call it login or something like that. Let's just see how that form looks and see if it looks reasonably presentable. So there we go. And of course I could put some text in front of these as well, so let's say here email and password, and run it again, and there we go. Okay, now if I go back to my controller here and run this, I want the form to submit to my controller, and so the action here will be relative to the domain name. It's the context root and then controller here, which was the URL, the end bit of the URL if I run the controller basically. And now I'm probably on a like typical website, we'll also have some sort of page that where you click login to go to the login form. So let's have one of those as well. I'll create a new JSP. Let's call it index.jsp. And on there, let's have a link that lets you go to the login form. So let's say href equals, and then again, because I'm following strict MVC or Model 2 architecture here, I'm going to route everything through the controller. So this is going to go through the controller, and the controller is going to know what page I want to see because it's going to have an action parameter here, and I'll set this action to login. So question mark and action equals login, and that's the complete URL that I want to go to. If I click this link, which will say click here to log in, and let's close off that tag. Now the controller itself, I can make that the home page of my website, and I'm going to have a doGet method. In my doGet method, I'm going to check the parameter. I'll check the action parameter, so I'll say string action equals let's see, string action equals request.get parameter action, and I'll say if action equals null, then I'm going to say request dot get request dispatcher, and I'll say and I'll just dispatch to index.jsp. Actually, by default, index.jsp will be an index page. So if I just run the site with nothing after the context root, I'll go to index.jsp, which is fine actually at the moment. And then I'm going to say else. Now, if there's a login parameter, because if I click on index.jsp, if I click on this link now, it's going to go to the controller with a login parameter, and then I'm going to say request dot. I've got to remember to forward this as well, so I need to say forward, otherwise it won't actually do anything. And I'll say request and response. And now, if there is an action parameter, so if there's an action parameter and if it's set to login, then I'm going to go to my login.jsp, so to login.jsp. Now let's check that all works. So I'll run the controller, and I think it should work. And if there's no action parameter to the controller, then I'm just going to see index.jsp, because it's going to say okay, do get, and then action is null, so display index.jsp, and then index.jsp has this link, and that sets action to login. And if I click on that, I'm going to go to my controller with the action set to login, the action parameter. And of course, I could have called this parameter absolutely anything. I've just chosen action because it's an appropriate name that's kind of traditional. But if that's set to login, it goes to the login form. And now the login form, if I submit that, I also want to go to the controller. So that's why I've set the action of the form here to the controller. And I want to tell the controller that the form has been submitted, and that it should try to validate the form data. And to do that, I'm going to put in here, in my form, I'm going to add a input type equals hidden. And I'm going to set the name of it to action, because this is going to supply an action parameter. And the value I'll set to, let's say, do login. Oh, I actually already created one of those. Okay, so I don't need that. So if you submit the form, it goes to the controller with the action parameter set to do login. So let's handle that as well now. So if I go to the controller here, and now the twist is, you've got to remember that if you submit the form, and on a form you should usually have the method set to post. So it's not going to invoke the doGet method of your servlet, it's going to invoke the doPost method. So we'll end up down here in doPost. I'll do Ctrl-Shift-F to format that. And again, I need to check that the action's not null, just in case. It's always prudent to do that. And then if the action is not null and it's equal to do login, now I can try to validate my form contents. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the data from the form. So the form has controls on it that are called email and password. So I'm going to say string email equals request.getParameter email, and I'm going to say string password equals request.getParameter password. And now in my user bean, I actually gave it a constructor that takes an email and a password string. And don't forget that with beans you've got to have a default constructor, but there's nothing to stop you supplying other constructors that take arguments. So if the form's submitted, I'm then going to get the information from it, and I'm going to create a bean by saying user equals new user, and I'm going to supply, let's add the input there with Ctrl-Shift-O, beans.user. And if I then do Control Space, the autocomplete will show me what constructors I've got, and I'm going to pass in the email and password. And I'm now going to say if user.validate, so this is the validate code that we added to the bean in the previous tutorial, then I can go to another page, and the page that I'll go to, let's create a new page here, and I'll call it success, or let's call it login success.jsp. That'll do. I'll just copy the name there as well while I'm at it. Click finish, and now let's say here logged in. So in my controller now, if I can validate the form, I'll say request.getRequest dispatcher, and I'll dispatch to login success.jsp, and I need to remember to forward there request and response. So I'm forwarding the request and response objects here when I go to the page. And if I can't validate the form, then I want to go back to the form again. So I want to say here, I want to forward to my login page, login.jsp. Now that's all fine, but there are some bits missing here, because for start, if I go back to the form again, I want the form to remember the stuff that the user typed in it. If not the password, then at the very least the email. And to do that, because there's no request.set parameter, I'm going to use request.set attribute. So I'm going to say here that, in fact, let's put it up here and let's say request.set attribute email. And I may or may not decide to set the password as a attribute, because you could feel that that's somehow insecure and that the password should not be stored in this way. But let's set it here just as a demo. So I'll set the email and passwords as attributes on the request object, and then when I go to my pages, I'm forwarding the request object. So in login.jsp, I can say here, I can use a scriptlet, an expression tag, and say request.get attribute to set the value of the email control on the form, and let's say get attribute email. And I can do the same thing for the value of the password field if I want to. So let's set that as well. And you've got to remember that failing to validate the form is not the only way you can get to the form, because initially you go to it via a link. And if you go to it via a link, you go to the controller, and then you're doing a get, an HTTP get, because it's a URL that you're going to, and then it will have this action set, and up there I can set that attribute. So I can say, well, I need to set both attributes actually, because I want the form initially to have blank values for email and password. So let's just say here, let's copy this set attribute stuff, and if I go directly to the form, I'll set those attributes to just empty strings like this. Now if I can log in successfully, I want to echo back the email attribute just as a demo. So I'll say logged in with email. Let's say here request.get attribute email, and the way I end up on this login success page is if I submit the form, so the action equals do login, and I can validate the form successfully, and in that case I want to make sure that I've set the email attribute, but I have done because I've set it up here, so this is good for both this forward and this forward as well. Now I think I've got everything that I need here. Let's check and let's run it and see if I've forgotten anything. So it looks okay. So I'll run my controller. Oh, I have forgotten something actually, because what about the error message that appears if I can't validate the form? Let's add in that as well. So let's say here, let's have an error message down here, let's say. So again, I'll put it in H2 tags, which is not really very nice, but it'll do for our purposes here. And let's just echo back an attribute called validate error, or let's say validation message. Doesn't really matter what I call it. And just close my H2 tag there. There we go. Let's just copy that. Now again, when I initially go to the form via a link, I want to say okay that this validation message is just blank, so request.set attribute, paste in the name of the attribute and set it to nothing there. And when I go to it via a failed form submit, which will be here if I can't validate the user bean, then I want to set that, and I want to set it to say request.set attribute. I want to set it to user.getMessage, because I put that code in the user bean that sets the message of the user bean if you try to validate it and the validation is not successful. Let's see how that looks if I run this now. So initially I'll go to the home page with a login link on it, and I'll click this login, and here's my form, and let's initially add something that's wrong, that will fail, cause the validation to fail. Click OK, and it says invalid email address, and let's say john@caveofprogramming.com. Click OK. Password must be at least 8 characters. Click OK, and we've got one error still here, which is that in my login success page, I think, do we have a problem there? Let's just check that error. So unable to compile class for JSP, login success.jsp, and the reason is just that I forgot the beginning of the expression tag here. So my intention was to output this attribute with an expression tag. So bear with me, I think we're there. I think we've got everything working now. So let's retry. And yeah, now I've submitted the same information again. And now we can see on the login success page, it's echoing back my email. And let's just try once more, because it'd be nice to see it working from scratch. So I'll say john@caveofprogramming.com, and if the validation fails, then we get a message, and if it succeeds, then we set the request attribute, the email attribute in the request, and go to login success. So that's it for this tutorial, a complete example of form validation. And in future tutorials, we're gonna look at more stuff that will help you to do more flexible stuff with this, like setting stuff in the session, setting persistent information in the session. And we're going to look, of course, in the future at JDBC, because usually if you have a login form, you'd want to go to a database and see if your user's in there already or not, and we'll look at that in the future. So join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.